The reading is taken from John chapter 20. Jesus appears to his disciples. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Jesus appears to Thomas. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." The purpose of John's Gospel. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is the word of the Lord.
Hi, if we haven't met before, I'm Mary Edwards. I'm one of the lay readers at Aldwych Parish Church. Why do people write books or magazine articles? Just at the moment, many of us may have had reason to turn to books or articles on cookery, gardening and so on. So I looked around my bookshelves and I decided it would either be to inform, like something on gardening, a handbook on cookery or handicrafts, maybe a good guidebook to a walking trail or a foreign city we've enjoyed. Perhaps it would be to entertain, like a good novel, or maybe a book to persuade me, to make me think, like booklets, all of them of course printed on recycled paper, to tell me how to use less paper or plastic and so on. Or perhaps it's a combination of these three, maybe a good biography or autobiography that makes me think, or some of my favourites, like these. The books written over 60 years ago by Alfred Wainwright, Guides to Walking in the Lake District, which are certainly handbooks. They do tell you how to safely walk up a particular hill and give you several options for doing so. But they also make very good reading when I'm away from the hills, and are so full of warmth and his love and care for the hills that they make me want to go and discover more. The passage we have for today is from John's Gospel, written by one of Jesus' disciples, John, someone who'd been with Jesus as he travelled, he taught, he preached, and he healed. Now, John was scholarly, and he probably knew that the other three writings that became the Gospels of Matthew, of Mark, and of Luke were already in circulation when he put his account of the life of Jesus together. John has a different approach. It is to John, for example, that we owe the I am statements. Jesus saying, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life." And he also has a different approach. It's almost as if he's trying to answer the question, why? Why did Jesus come? And nowhere is this better illustrated than in this passage about Thomas, another of Jesus' disciples. Now Thomas had been with Jesus throughout most of his ministry. He'd walked the dusty roads, he'd seen how Jesus healed and taught. He'd noticed Jesus' care for the outcast and for the poor, for those who were sick, those who needed healing in body, mind, or spirit. He'd watched Jesus fall foul of the authorities, been with him on the entry into Jerusalem on what we now call Palm Sunday, and he'd been with him at the Garden of Gethsemane. He knew that Jesus had been tried and had been crucified and had died and been buried. Jesus appeared to the disciples on the evening of what we now call Easter Day. Predictably, the disciples were in fear of the authorities and the door was locked, and so when Jesus greeted them with the usual greeting, "Peace be with you," this was no mere formal greeting. He met them where they were, in every sense of the word. They recognised him, risen from the dead. This was one more incident that formed a major part of the evidence for the resurrection, and this was no mere ghost, no hallucination. He came in peace, but he also gave them power in the form of the Holy Spirit. But Thomas wasn't there, and when he heard about it from men who must have been staggered, amazed, joyful, fearful, he wondered. I wondered what he thought. Was he annoyed because he'd missed something? Or was he wary, given what they'd claimed they'd experienced, very wary about taking all this second hand? In fact, he went so far as to say that he would only believe if he could both see and touch the wounds of Jesus. Thomas had doubts. I think they must have been genuine doubts because a few days later, Jesus answered them. He appeared to all of them again and again greeted them in peace. And then he addressed Thomas directly. You doubted? Okay, see, here is the evidence. Don't doubt, but believe. Now, we don't know if Thomas did actually touch those awful, vile wounds. But really, he didn't need to, because he had met the risen Jesus. This was not a second-hand message. It was a first-hand meeting. And his words to Jesus say it all. My Lord and my God. For Thomas had not only seen that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead, but had recognized him as the Son of God and as his Lord. His words are important. My Lord and my God was what he called Jesus. Now, Thomas is sometimes known as Doubting Thomas, but I think that's unfair. He became Believing Thomas, because this is the first recorded incident of any of the disciples saying this to Jesus. We can only imagine that scene, and so we have to imagine the tone of voice that Jesus used when he spoke to Thomas. I don't think it was harsh, or criticising, or rejecting. It wasn't scathing. It was only wanting him, Thomas, to have the opportunity to believe and to know Jesus. Not second-hand from the others, but in a first-hand meeting. When we have doubts, we may need to talk them out with a trusted friend. But let's be honest, that's not really going to be possible at the moment. But we can always take them to Jesus. I have found that when I take time to be with Jesus, to tell him about what's concerning me, he does answer. Often not in a way that I might expect, but always in a way that's right for me and that displays his love for me. So I can simply recommend this to you. If you have honest doubts or questions, either about the evidence for the Christian faith or about your life as a Christian, and in current circumstances, many of us have plenty of questions and doubts and worries. Take time to be with Jesus. Tell him about them and expect him to answer, not in the same way he did for Thomas or for me or for anyone else, but in a way that's appropriate for you. To come back to my original question, why did John write his gospel? Well, the answer is in the last verse of this chapter. Remembering how Thomas responded and how Jesus spoke to Thomas. Look at the final verse of this chapter. That you or we might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and by believing have life in his name. It is that life in his name that I commend to you. Jesus wants each of us to know him, to be able to say, he's my Lord and my God. Whatever our situation this weekend, he is there for us. Let's take time to be with him.